So before we begin this video, I want to reiterate a couple points. First, we decided to call this Into the Weeds for a reason. The bottom line is that Jubal and I are basically geeks. We like getting into details. We like looking at minutia. And so we're going to be talking about complicated topics. We're going to be talking about things that you may not have heard because we're geeks. What can we say? But what we're going to do is we're going to do our best to make these concepts understandable. So if we bring stuff up and you're like, what the hell are they talking about? If we're talking about it, it's because we think that there's something serious going on, something important. And so that's the first thing I wanted to say. The second thing is if this goes the way we want it to, if you're looking for something that's just going to confirm all your pre-existing beliefs, you probably aren't going to find it here. Like if for those of you on the left, and what you want is good, like good old-fashioned Trump bashing, that's not the project here. We're not trying to be hyperbolic. We're trying to be analytical. And we're trying to answer, sort of in true academic fashion, a limited question. Are we moving in an authoritarian direction? Right? And so that's what we're going to be getting into. Um, as I said in a previous video, if the sky is falling, if it looks like we're moving in authoritarian direction, I'm going to say so. I'm not going to hesitate at all. But if it's not, I'm going to say so as well. So there may be things happening that are objectionable. There may be things that I don't like. But the question we're going to be asking is the United States becoming more authoritarian? That's the focus. That's what we're looking at. So I just wanted to reiterate those points in terms of what we're trying to accomplish.
I think that probably is really important, and so I just want to echo that again. Just because things are happening that you don't like or you don't agree with, just because there are policies that are being put in place that you might not like, it doesn't mean that your hair is on fire and the world is coming to an end and authoritarianism is taking over. Part of this conversation, a big part of maybe of this conversation that we're going to have over these next few videos, um, is figuring out how to have this conversation. How do we really determine whether or not this administration is moving in an authoritarian direction? What does that even mean? How can we gauge it? The things that Phil has said as far as empirically looking at this, that's accurate. Neither one of us is here to just talk about the same stuff that you're going to run into on any news network. We want to try to come up with a framework for how we can measure that. So that said, we have decided to leave the comments section open. Phil, you wanted to say something about that?
Yeah, so we're going to leave the comment section open now, sort of as an experiment. We know that sometimes these things can get nasty, the comments on these kind of podcasts and things like that. We'd love to get feedback from people, and we may even respond to questions and to comments. But we're not going to tolerate incivility. We're not going to tolerate personal attacks. But that doesn't mean that you can't ask a difficult question, to either me, to Jubal, to both of us. And who knows, maybe if we see somebody who's making some really interesting comments and observations, we'll invite you to join uh, one of our conversations as well.
Absolutely. So if you like it, tell your friends, and if you don't, go away. All right. So let's get started.
There we
Phil,
go.
Phil, it's
So here's the thing.
to you.
We were talking about this book, How Democracies Die. That was sort of the premise for how we were going to structure this conversation. And as I told you, there are some weaknesses in that book. One of the weaknesses, as I said before, was that they didn't have a Jubal, right? They had two people who agreed on everything. They didn't have a Jubal. So the other problem from the very outset was the failure to distinguish between the growth of executive power, like relative to Congress or relative to courts, which is something that concerns both Jubal and I, and movement in an authoritarian direction. Those two things are not the same thing. So, what we want to do is we want to talk about that and sort of distinguish between what is it that we see that looks like the growth of executive power, something that's been happening for the last 60 years, even longer, some of which is problematic. And then the difference between that and becoming more authoritarian. So for me, I'm going to start off, and you will just jump in whenever you want to. When I talk about the growth of executive power, when I'm concerned about the growth of executive power, I'm talking about the expansion of presidential authority and the authority of the president to influence decision making. More and more, our political system has become presidential centric. With the framers, when they adopted the Constitution, I really think they believed that Congress should be the center of sort of the political universe, but it's now the president. So, how does that happen? How has presidential power grown a lot? Well, part of it is the increase happens is presidential prerogatives are oftentimes invoked in times of crisis. Country needs feels a need to sort of have a strong leader. So the attacks on 9/11 are a perfect example where the Patriot Act was passed. Go ahead, Jubal.
I think a more salient example actually would be COVID, right? You can see an expansion of executive power even without a powerful executive. I think that we would all agree that the current administration, Donald Trump, is a much more powerful executive personality than Joe Biden was. And yet, under the Biden administration, we saw a significant expansion of powers of the presidency, of the executive branch of the government, not just the presidency, not just the office, but just the executive branch of the government. Now, something to keep in mind: the growth of executive power is not just the growth of the president himself. It's not just the things that are happening in the White House. Executive power means, for instance, the power of the FBI. That's part of the executive power base of the country. The power of the immigration and border control systems. Anything that has to do with the enforcement of law is the executive branch. And so clearly there's a connection between a country becoming more authoritarian and a country having more executive power, meaning more enforcement power. But those two things don't necessarily go hand in hand. And I think that was the thing that I was trying to explain as far as my trajectory view of authoritarianism. Anyway, back to you, sir.
Right, and I want to reiterate the same point. A growth of executive power is concerning if it goes too far, if it knocks our system out of balance. But it's not the same thing as becoming more authoritarian, and that's what I kind of want to get into. So, how have presidents? How do they exert themselves? Either themselves at the White House or um, through the various agencies that they control. Well, they do it through executive orders. One of the things that we've seen at the beginning of the Trump administration, and this is not uncommon, is at the beginning of an administration, presidents go ahead and try and uh, sort of issue a slew of executive orders, especially if the previous president was of a different party. So it's through the use of executive orders. It's used through the use of executive agreements. This is where the president makes an agreement with a foreign country, not a treaty. It's not binding. It's it's good for just as long as the president has power. So when the U.S. got involved in the Iranian nuclear deal, the JCPOA is what it's called, that was an executive agreement. That's why we're getting involved in the Paris Agreement. That was an executive agreement. That's why President Obama put us in the Paris Agreement. When President Trump came in, he took us out. When Biden he was elected, he put us back in. Now Trump has pulled us back out. That's standard stuff. That's standard stuff, not moving in an authoritarian direction, just
Right.
standard
So
politics.
that's an important thing to understand, I think, is that the use of executive orders is basically just they're like signposts that this is what this administration is working towards, right? And every administration, every duly elected administration has not just the right but the responsibility to do that, to push their agenda forward. That's what the American people have voted for, right? And so the idea that executive orders are somehow tied to a move in an authoritarian direction, I think that we can agree that that's not the case at all. That all
Hmm.
administrations use executive orders, and that because executive orders are only good for as long as that particular president is in office, they are not indicative of a move in an authoritarian direction.
Right. Absolutely. And then just the one other thing that presidents can do is something called signing statements. This is a particularly detailed thing that we may get into later on, but for right now, we don't need to. The other thing about the growth of executive power is part of the reason that it's happened is that Congress frequently passes laws, and when they pass these laws, they give executives more authority. And so you can't really call that movement in an authoritarian direction, because in cases like that, presidents are acting within the scope of the law as defined by the legislature. So when Congress creates agencies or reorganizes agencies or departments within the executive branch, they give president the authority to control those things. That gives them more power. There are specific laws that actually delegate authority to the president. I'm just going to briefly talk about a couple just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about. There's something called presidential drawdown authority. This is when right before President Biden left office, he gave a bunch of military aid to Israel. There was nothing passed by Congress. There was no package that had been passed by Congress. But what the Congress had done, it passed legislation giving presidents this presidential drawdown authority, right? Which means that they can take stuff from military stocks and give it to foreign countries without congressional approval. It was to deal with crises where something needed to be done quickly. But you can't say that's authoritarian because again, he's in this case, President Biden was acting fully within the scope of the law. The power that he was exerting was unilateral. Congress wasn't consulted, but it was Congress who gave him that authority. And so we're going to see instances like that where presidents are exercising a lot of power, and it'll turn out that they're acting fully within the law. That also isn't moving in authoritarian direction. That's Congress giving presidents authority and them exercising that authority. And this isn't a case of them being expected to use institutional forbearance. They're literally complying with the law and doing what the law was designed to do. The other way that presidential power has grown is that there have been rulings that have essentially expanded presidential authority. I mean, I'm somebody who's particularly troubled by the court's rulings on presidential immunity, right? But Congress, I mean, the courts in that case expanded, in my estimation, in a way that was not good, expanded presidential authority. So all of those things may be problematic depending on how you view it, but they're not necessarily moving in an authoritarian direction. And one of the things that I mean, I know Jubal and I do this, is that when we're looking at these things, if you're looking at a president exercising authority, if the idea is if if you're a Republican, if Donald Trump has this authority, it's okay. If Joe Biden has it, it's not. You're not being honest. You're not being clear about this. You should be looking at admit both parties and saying, should presidents, regardless of their party, have these particular powers? So the thing about yeah, go ahead, Jubal.
So I just want to I want to talk about one thing real quick, which I think is a positive thing that is actually a counterbalance to what Phil has been talking about, which is the steady expansion of executive power over the last 60 years, was the Chevron case. Actually, this was a strong push towards the libertarian side because basically what it said, and if my understanding is imperfect, please correct me, Phil. But basically, what Chevron said was agencies that are formed by the executive branch um, do not get to arbitrarily enumerate their own powers. Right? They don't get to just say that this is what they have the authority to do. They are actually subject to the judiciary. Right? They're not all powerful. Right? So that's a significant move away from executive power. So even while these other things are happening that are increasing executive power, we see things like Chevron, which is a move away from executive power. Anyway, go ahead.
Right, and I would just interpret sort of the ruling in the Chevron case a little bit differently. And the way it's still what Jim was saying is absolutely correct, is that that was a growth of judicial power. It's that previously in previous court decisions, what the courts have said is that they will defer to the judgment of the bureaucracy. They'll defer to
Hmm.
the experts within the particular agencies. And so deference was given to the bureaucrats and the decisions they made. When they overturned that, they asserted a more powerful role for the courts in that. And so Jubal's absolutely right. This amounts to an increased power on the part of the judiciary in overseeing the executive branch, which again is not moving in an authoritarian direction. So we've talked about all this. Well, how do we know we're still in the bounds of just this growth of executive power? Well, there are always limitations placed on the president. There are the checks and balances where each branch has the ability to keep the other one constrained. And then there's a separation of powers where each branch has its own responsibilities. So, for example, Congress has control over appropriation. They have the power of the purse. This is the first power given to them in the Constitution. It's clear that this was the framers had in mind. And so the presidents might want to do something, but if Congress says, we're not giving you money for it, um, that's an example of a restraint on executive power. When a president tries to do something and can't, that's an indication that we're not moving in an authoritarian direction. The quick example was when Barack Obama was elected. One of the things he wanted to do was he wanted to shut down Guantanamo Bay. And so he issued an executive order on day one that within a year, the executive branch, the Guantanamo Bay would be ended. It's still open today. They're talking about increasing it and sending more people there. It never got shut down. Why? Because Obama needed money to get his order taken care of. And Congress said, no, we're not
Hmm.
doing that. So Congress can, through its control over appropriations, um, have an impact. If that's happening, if Congress is asserting itself, um, then we're not, that is an example of moving in authoritarian direction. Also, quite frequently, what happens is the courts have made rulings that have called things that presidents have tried to do unconstitutional. Um, and the courts have accepted that. The example here are the travel bans that President Trump put in his first administration. Did a travel ban? The court said that's unconstitutional. He rewrote it. They said the second time it's unconstitutional. He rewrote it a third time. They said that worked.
There
Okay,
you go.
goodness.
So
And
that's a good example right there. That's a check on presidential authority, right? So when Donald Trump says we're going to ban everybody who's Muslim from coming into the country, the court said, okay, that, that's probably a little too broad a brush. So let's get a little bit more specific. Okay, well, we're going to ban everybody from Muslim majority countries. Okay, that still isn't exactly right, you know. And so they went through and they changed it around to using the terrorist watch list a little bit more actively, and that was okay. You know, we can do that. Banning somebody based on their faith, not constitutional. Banning somebody based on the fact that they are on a terrorist watch list. Okay, that's something a little bit more usable. Go ahead.
right, and the most important thing is that when the court said no, you can't do that, Donald Trump didn't say, yeah, I can.
Right,
He said, damn, okay,
right.
let me try it again.
So
That's the way it's supposed to work.
that's the way that
That
it's
is
supposed to
how the
work.
system is supposed to work.
So a quick story about Andrew Jackson, and I think that this story is apocryphal. I don't know that it's exactly necessarily correct. But he was, this is back in 1832, is that right? This is a while ago. Um, he uh, he had a showdown with the Supreme Court. I believe John Marshall was the Chief Justice at that time. They came through with a ruling about this was in the lead up to the Trail of Tears. Do I have that correct, Phil?
Thinks that, yeah,
So they said basically Jackson was saying, I don't think that Native Americans are American citizens, so we're going to expel them from the country. That's what the Trail of Tears was all about. The Supreme Court said, actually, they are. Constitutionally, they are American citizens. And Jackson supposedly said, I understand the Chief Justice has laid down this decree. I now invite him to enforce it, which is basically right.
Fuck
Like
you.
you've got no power, right? The judiciary doesn't have a a group of officers that they can send out to enforce their decisions. Enforcement is a purely executive power, and so he basically just defied the court. Now, how much of that is true, how much of that is not true, how much of that is misunderstood by history, whatever. But if we say somebody is getting Jacksonian, that means that that's a president or that's someone in the executive branch who is basically defying the judicial branch. And this relates back to institutional forbearance, right? One of the things that we talked about in the initial video, which is the idea that you don't burn down the country when you don't get your way, right? You don't sacrifice the safeguards that are in place in the country to push your agenda forward. And if that story about Andrew Jackson is true, then that is precisely what he did. He defied the court. He took he took the law into his own hands, essentially. So if we see that kind of thing happening, I think, and I think Phil would agree, that would be a good metric for saying, okay, here's somebody who is moving certainly in an authoritarian direction. So a Jacksonian effort would be, I think, a way to objectively determine whether or not somebody is being authoritarian. So with regards to the Muslim ban, what I would say is, if we're using the Jacksonian rule of authoritarianism, using that as a measure, that Trump in his first term was not authoritarian with regards to the Muslim ban. The same is also true with Joe Biden with regards to his efforts to relieve student debt. Right? He decided he wanted to forgive student debt. He did some things that the court said were not constitutional, and he tried to do it again. It didn't work. So as long as the president doesn't just openly defy the judiciary and do what he wants to do anyway, I think that that's a sign that authoritarianism is not happening. Would you agree with that, Phil?
I agree 100%. In fact, I would go so far as to say that is the system working.
Right.
It's not that it's not authoritarian. That's the way it works. So then now we've talked a little bit about what do we mean by growth of executive power. Does it mean to move in an authoritarian direction? This is a little bit sort of more complicated, but I think we want to get into this. So when there's a systematic erosion of democratic norms, to this mutual tolerance of one another and the institutional forbearance, the norms that guide and restrain conflict and democracy, when there's a systematic erosion of those, that can be an indication that you're moving in an authoritarian direction. Now, we have to balance that out because the Trump administration came in specifically with the idea of there being disruptors. They're looking at the institutions as flawed, and so they want you to disrupt them. So just being a disruptive force isn't moving in an authoritarian direction. It's got to be more than that. Um, Concentration of power in the into the executive, where the legislature is being stripped of its authority. That's a cause for concern, especially if it looks like it's outside the bounds of the law. Um, if you see suppression of freedoms, a suppression of dissent, that can also be another indication that we're moving in an authoritarian direction. But these are different because none of that interplay between the branches is happening. It's not happening in the same way. And so, like we've talked about before, disregard for the checks and balances, the checks that the judiciary places, the checks that Congress places, even the role of state governments, that can all be an indication, just disregarding their role in the decision-making process. If we see an erosion of civil liberties, this is something that Jubal talked about when he talked about the movement sort of from libertarian to authoritarian, the idea that there's going to be a suppression of civil rights and a concentration of power into the executive. There's another indication that we're moving in an authoritarian direction, a suppression of the press, increased surveillance of citizens, without congressional authorization. If there's congressional authorization, that becomes a grayer area. Any efforts to weaken electoral integrity or to suppress votes or to disregard electoral outcomes, legitimate, established uh, electoral outcomes, are all indications that we may be moving in an authoritarian direction. But again, not if they're recognizing the constraints that we've talked about before. So take, for example, the legal battles over the 2020 election. Donald Trump filed 60 different cases and lost almost all of them. But in each case, when the courts made their decisions, he accepted them. Now he wasn't present at the time, so that was um, a different story. But it was accepted. This is what happened. This is what the courts have done. Again, it gets a little more complicated because he wasn't in power at the time. But acknowledging the role of the courts, acknowledging limitations of Congress, these are all sort of within the normal bounds of politics. So taking that as our broad sort of guideline, Jubal, what are some guideposts that we can use as we're looking at the unfolding of the Trump administration that would let us know that we can sort of say ahead of time, hey, if we see this, this is what it's going to look like. This is how we're going to interpret it. We want to do this ahead of time, not selectively and not after the fact, whenever we can.
I think the biggest thing that we should look for, because this is something that you and I have talked about before. I do think that we are going to come to a head on the 14th Amendment. I think that the movements that the Trump administration is making, as far as uh, uh, removing illegal aliens from the country, the statements that they have made with regards to naturalized citizenship, being born in this country means that you're a citizen. That's going to come to a head. So if the ruling comes down from the higher courts that, yeah, anybody who is born in this country for whatever reason, in whatever fashion, is a citizen of the United States, if we see the executive branch ignore that and say, well, if you're born to, if you're the child of two illegal aliens, even if you're born in the country, we're gonna kick you out, right? That would be an example of defying the judiciary. That would be a Jacksonian example, I think. So we should watch for that. I think that would be one of the key indicators that there actually is an authoritarian movement. Now, one other thing, this might be a little bit more subtle. Authoritarianism can manifest as, and this might be a little bit off topic, but it certainly it can manifest in the way that the government and the press interact. If you have, it, it I would be interested to hear your thoughts on this, Phil. If you have press sources that are intentionally pushing out information that they know to be incorrect in an effort to promote a particular agenda, would you see that as a move towards the authoritarian, or would you just see that as bad?
Well, the press can't be becoming authoritarian.
If you
Is that
have if you have the government essentially pushing orders to the press, saying, "This is what we want you to cover. This is what we want you to talk about. This is how we want you to say it." Uh,
Yeah, I think any kind of governmental control over um, media outlets is going to be problematic. Um, I mean, this is like standard in authoritarian regimes. One of the things they do is they try and control what the press does and doesn't do. And so
right.
I think if you see a movement where there's an effort to control what the press does, um, that can be an indication. But one of the things that Jibble and I talked about, and then I'll let you get back to this, is that there isn't going to be like this tipping point where all of a sudden it's going to be like, we are now authoritarian, right? It's going to be a death by a thousand cuts. It's going to happen
Mhm.
a little bit at a time. So there might be something having to do with the legislators, something having to do with the courts, something having to do with the press, something having to do in the federalist system between the federal government and state governments. So we're not neither Jubal and I believe that there's like this endpoint where we're just automatically it's just going to change. It's going to be, do we see these patterns over and over again in little tiny areas? So for me,
Right.
any effort on the part, every government is going to try and shape news coverage. Every party is going to try and shape news coverage. If the government uses coercive power to try and shape news coverage, threatens lawsuits or threatening jail, things like that. If the government uses coercive power to shape coverage, then I think you're looking at moving in an authoritarian direction.
Right.
Uh,
So I agree with that. I think that it's not just that the government and a particular press outlet are on the same page, right? For
right.
instance, the Trump administration and Fox News are going to be on the same page on a lot of issues, right? Just like the Biden administration and MSNBC were on the same page on a lot of different issues. That's not necessarily authoritarian. What is authoritarian is when the government says you have to cover this way, or we're going to audit you, or you're going to have to, we're going to deregulate your industry or whatever. Some sort of coercive effort to force information outlets to promote particular messages. That's something. So the Jacksonian rule and the coercive media rule, I think, are two things that we can keep an eye out for. There's one other thing to keep in mind with regards to checks and balances, and this is again a little nuanced. Um, just because a a check against executive power is not tripped doesn't mean that it isn't an authoritarian movement, right? So in other words, the president could slide one past the Congress or the judiciary and expand executive power, do something a little hinky without one of the checks or the balances swatting down that effort, right? Um, I can't think of an example of that off the top of my head. Maybe you can think of something like that, Phil. But it's not a hard and fast rule that anytime the president tries to do something that is outside the scope, that a check or a balance is automatically going to be invoked. So an absence of the invocation of checks and balances does not necessarily mean an absence of authoritarian movement. That's my point.
Correct. Yeah, so I agree with that as well. And then again, it becomes complicated because um, one of the things that for me has always been important is that I think the people who in the individual branches, the legislative branch, the executive branch, and judicial branch, should all, in order for a system to work, jealously guard their own prerogatives. If you're a member of Congress, you should be jealously guarding the prerogatives of Congress. I would expect presidents to do the same thing, jealously guard the prerogatives of the executive branch, and the judiciary to do the same thing. One of the things that will concern me is if I see a president, any president, so we're talking about Donald Trump right now, but this would apply to any president, that if a president goes beyond what is his or her constitutional authority, but Congress is controlled by the same party, and so they don't object to their authority being ignored or limited. Again, even though Congress is going along with it, that doesn't necessarily mean we're not moving in an authoritarian direction. And this is sort of the into the weeds shit that and I do all the time. It's complicated. It's complicated. You're looking for like sort of easy, simple explanations. This isn't going to be the place to find them.
Right.
Um,
Right. Well, I mean, we're still trying to determine the best possible definition for what authoritarianism even is.
right.
But I think that we've made progress. We've got two metrics now that we can look at. We can look at the Jacksonian effect, right? And we can look at the coercive media effect. And so those two things, I mean, that's a place to start. That gives us something objective that we can use as a measuring stick to determine whether or not a particular administration is being authoritarian or is moving in an authoritarian direction. But properly defining the term is still something that is going to take a little bit of time. This certainly isn't going to be the last video in our series. Is there anything else that you want to broach before we move on to the next episode?
No, no. So we can wrap this up for now. And I think what we're going to do in the next episode is we're going to sort of jump into what's been going on. So there have been a slew
Current
of
events.
current the current events section of the this series, just to help us catch up on where we are. We originally wanted to launch this on the 20th, and we weren't successful. So we're going to go ahead and start looking into individual executive orders and what they mean, what they could portend, and try and refer back to sort of the guideposts that Jubal has been talking about, the Jacksonian model, the coercive use of the government's authority, and then start to dive into what happens when the legislative branch and the judicial branch and the executive branch are all on the same page. Is what does that necessarily mean? Does that mean we are or aren't moving in an authoritarian direction? This is kind of where we're going to be going. So if this seemed complicated to you, it's probably just going to get worse.
It almost certainly will. But hopefully, we're going to come up with some more metrics on how we can measure whether or not administrations are authoritarian. That's the whole point of this series. And we're gonna narrow down the definition of what authoritarianism means over time. So we hope you stick with us, and we'll see you next time.
And one last thing, if you have some thoughts on some guideposts, post them in the comments section and we'll take a look at them and
We'd
maybe
love to hear them.
incorporate that. Absolutely.
Thanks,
So
everybody. Talk to you soon.
take care, everyone.